and welcome to the latest episode of Suits and Boots, the TDi podcast. I'm Sarah Wilkinson, TDi Sustainability's Marketing Manager, and I'm joined today by Sunil Abeyasekera, an ESG consultant at TDi, to discuss the latest developments in the EU Deforestation Regulation. The EU DR, as it's known, was due to come into force on the 30th of December this year, so in just a few weeks' time. At the time of recording, the EU Parliament has just approved a one-year delay to the regulation's implementation, as well as an additional package of amendments. So Sunil, first things first, can you explain briefly to our listeners what the EU Deforestation Regulation is and what led to its development?
Absolutely. The regulation is one of the EU's strategies to curb the increasing deforestation across the world. Half of all forests are being lost due to the conversion of forests into cropland and land for grazing livestock. The main drivers of deforestation, especially for the EU, are palm oil, soy, and wood, with coffee, cattle, and rubber having a considerable impact. The EU member countries imported and consumed 1/3 of these products over the last decade in their derivatives, and these contribute to their associated deforestation. While companies and certification systems have been advocating and creating a demand and developing the systems for deforestation-free goods, the EU has accelerated this development by prohibiting the importation of deforestation-associated goods from entering the market, beginning with those 7 I mentioned earlier. The scope of the regulation is big, and its implementation will be difficult, but the effect of not addressing deforestation within our supply chains will be terrible.
So you said there that the scope of the regulation is big. What are some of the types of companies that the regulation will affect?
It's going to have an impact on all companies and industries as a whole, from coffee shops to supermarkets, artisanal chocolatiers to big brand confectioners. Tens of thousands of companies will be affected, and will have to better understand where and who they're sourcing from and its impacts on forests, farmers, and families near and far. However, their expectations and requirements of companies do differ widely across the supply chain.
Can you explain some of those different expectations and requirements then for different companies at different stages within the value chain?
Of course. So for upstream companies, so those companies and communities growing, farming and exporting the goods will need to be adhering to environmental and social requirements. So no deforestation and no child labour, free prior informed consent and things like this. These production areas will need to be mapped by EU companies. So legal rights and boundaries need to be determined and their coordinates shared. Midstream companies, so companies bringing the goods into market, transforming the goods before placing it onto the market, for example, transforming cocoa beans into cocoa powder, and large traders as well, are the main targets of this regulation. These companies will need to conduct due diligence, meaning they'll need to firstly collect traceability information, conduct risk assessments, risk mitigation, and reporting, and submit this information to the EU. An overview of the details we've provided in our EU Masterclass, EU Deforestation Masterclass, and we've also shared some guidance documents as well.
And what about downstream companies?
So small companies, retailers, and small traders will also be affected. They'll need to submit due diligence statements to the EU, stating that their supply chains are deforestation-free. So they'll need to better understand where their suppliers are sourcing from, and also use their leverage to influence their sourcing decisions.
And what happens if companies don't comply with the EU DR?
So from an environmental standpoint, a lot. We'll see continued deforestation, continued climate breakdown, and continued human rights abuses. From a reputational standpoint, also a lot. If companies don't comply, they'll incur fines proportional to their environmental damage, and their goods will be confiscated. Additionally, companies can be prohibited from placing products on the market, which is selling in the European Union, especially if there are serious and repeated infringements.
And so, as we mentioned in the introduction, the EU Parliament has just agreed to a delay in the implementation phase for the EUDR. The regulation was originally heralded by the EU as a key element of the European Green Deal. So why the delay now?
The EUDR came to force in June 2023, and large companies had 18 months to report on their due diligence. So this would be, December this year. But also the regulation was first proposed in 2021, where the expectations of companies were first being discussed. However, with all this notice, companies do still need more time to implement these requirements, mostly because the industry hasn't changed enough to report on traceability. In order to understand where deforestation is happening, companies need to be able to provide traceability to plantation and production and have their associated coordinates and shapefiles. However, these 7 commodities haven't really matured enough in the last 4 years to provide full traceability.
And why is that?
Prior to the announcement, companies were mostly relying on certification schemes as a proxy for deforestation free. However, companies were primarily purchasing mass balance, which is a mixture of certified and uncertified materials. Not much has changed in the last few years. The demand and availability for identity preserved is still small, and there is still a reliance on certification schemes, especially among smaller companies. But larger companies have been investing in satellite monitoring and segregating their supply chain into approved refineries and mills, which are sourcing from verified deforestation-free areas. But not all companies have the resource or time to conduct in-depth analysis into their supply chain. And these types of companies have been the ones that have been pushing for that delay.
You mentioned identity preserved there. Could you just explain what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So identity preserved is a type of supply chain model which companies like RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, as well as Rainforest Alliance and other certification systems use in order to determine, a level of sustainability and requirements within a particular commodity. So you'll find identity preserved, segregated as mass balance as different types of supply chain models. Identity preserved is the most robust and strongest. And this means you will be purchasing a type of commodity that is fully certified and you'll be provided the coordinates of where it came from. Segregated is similar to identity preserved, where you will be sourcing your commodity and it will be fully certified. However, you don't have that level of granularity of exactly where that material is coming from. And mass balance is a mixture of fully certified and uncertified materials. So identity preserved will be the only one that does align with the EU DR. But I think there has been discussions on integrating segregated as a model as well.
So with the delay that's just been approved, what are the new dates that our listeners need to be aware of?
The EU member states have agreed to delay the implementation of the EU DR by 12 months. What this means for companies are as follows. Large operators and traders will be required to report on their due diligence by the 30th of December 2025. Micro and small enterprises will have until the 30th of June 2026. That's a year later than originally planned.
And what else has been approved by the EU Parliament alongside this delay in implementation?
The Parliament has also made changes to the risk categories with the introduction of no-risk countries. This means there will be 4 risk categories: no risk, low risk, standard, and high risk. Countries classified as no risk are defined by the EU as countries with stable or increasing forest area development. These countries will face less stringent requirements. And the EU will publish the country benchmarking system by the 30th of June 2025. These changes will still need to be endorsed by both the Council and the Parliament, and also published in the EU official journal.
You mentioned this briefly before, but presumably this delay in implementation will have a negative impact on global forests in the meantime, meaning that deforestation that would have been prevented by the regulation will now continue. Are you able to give any numbers to that impact?
Yeah, for sure. So Global Witness calculated that the 1-year delay to the implementation could drive at least 150,000 hectares of deforestation. And to put this into perspective, this would be more than 14 times the size of Paris in these 12 months.
So the delay will have a significant impact on deforestation globally, but also some companies have already put quite a lot of resources, their time and their money into making sure that they'd be ready for the original implementation date. What is the impact of this delay on those companies who have already put in place the systems that were required to comply with the original deadline?
So there won't be any impact on those who've already implemented their due diligence systems. While it is disheartening to have spent the last few years preparing for this deadline, this has been time well spent. They are ahead of the curve and can spend the next 12 months further developing your relationships with the suppliers and understanding if there were any gaps. Supply chain mapping is complex and time-consuming and requires a high level of communication and planning. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of processes to be optimized. So in these next 12 months, I would like to see more knowledge sharing across industries. Deforestation needs to stop across the board, especially those that need support. These companies, if deforestation is only really happening or being excluded from their own supply chains, it's not going to have a big effect across the world.
So one of the main reasons for the delay was to give companies who hadn't yet been able to put in place all of the necessary due diligence systems around data recording and reporting the time to do so. How should these companies now approach this extra time that they have available to do this? What are some of the areas that you think they should prioritise, and where should they start?
These last 18 months sped by, and the next 12 months will speed by as well. This question will depend on how far along a company is, their sector and position in the supply chain. But I personally would first prioritise your own management systems and how information is collected and stored. I would ask the following questions. Firstly, do you have systems in place to collect traceability to mill and plantation data for each of your suppliers? This is essential and needs to happen, especially for the EU. Secondly, have your buying team and suppliers been trained on what deforestation-free is and what is required by the EU? So do they know that they need to provide certain guarantees and also coordinates and other types of information? Thirdly, are these requirements stipulated in contracts and onboarding documents to both new and existing suppliers? So are these requirements binding, and are they being communicated to everyone that's going to be joining the company? And also, how are you verifying the information that your supplier is providing? Many suppliers may claim that their supply is deforestation free, but do you have a way to verify this? Because if you don't, and the EU finds that deforestation is happening in your supply chain, you'll also be facing those fines and confiscations. So these are all key questions to be asking within your company, regardless of the size or position within the supply chain. Once you have an indication of where your commodities are coming from, you can then progress to risk assessments and mitigation. And this delay will also allow companies to review the European Commission's long-awaited guidance documents and their frequently asked questions, and help organisations continue to prepare for the EU DR's requirements.
And what about some of the concerns that have been expressed by countries producing the commodities covered by the regulation? What are some of those concerns, and how will the delay affect exporters and smallholders in those countries?
The EU Commission stated that they received concerns from global partners on the state of their preparedness and readiness for implementation. We've discussed the perspectives of importing companies, but we haven't really touched upon those exporting. There are challenges in producer countries to provide traceability and assurances that these supply chains are deforestation free. And there are concerns about the development of a two-tiered market, meaning deforestation-free commodities being supplied to the EU and everything else, deforestation-associated goods being supplied to the rest of the world. There's also a compliance burden generated as a result of the EU DR, and that is likely going to push out smallholders and shift sourcing to larger players that can afford to put in complex due diligence systems in place. Smallholders may instead increase their supplies to lower standard markets. Therefore, one benefit of this delay could be supporting the implementation of national traceability systems that include smallholders, especially to prevent them from being excluded. And if the 12-month period is used wisely, governments in producer countries can step in and support these smallholder farmers as well.
Do you think that the delay, therefore, could have an impact in preventing the two-tier system that you mentioned from being developed then?
I'd like to hope so. A lot can happen in 12 months, and many companies have rushed to just secure the most, what they deem as sustainable sources of production. But this regulation isn't about just excluding supply. It's about embracing supply and making meaningful change. So if national traceability systems are implemented, that would allow smallholders to continue to participate in our global trade.
And then what about other EU regulations? Is the EU DR cross-compatible with any of those, particularly the ones that have come into force recently around sustainable or responsible sourcing?
Yeah, so the EUDR is just one component of a broader set of legislations aimed at reducing the impact of European consumption within and outside the EU. These include the CSDDD. This is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which requires companies to set up due diligence systems to address environmental and social risks, and for businesses to also have a strategy that is compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. Another legislation which is tied to the EUDR is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires companies to report on their social and environmental risks and also to be audited upon these risks as well. And this, ties into the EUDR's due diligence system itself. This year, the EU announced the Forced Labour Regulation, which prohibits importation of forced labour-associated goods from entering the EU. They haven't stipulated the type of due diligence system required, only if you are found with deforestation-associated goods in your supply chain, these goods will be confiscated, you'll be fined, and you can be prohibited from selling on the EU market, much like the EUDR. And more recently, there's a Critical Raw Materials Act. This is the EU's strategy to scale up the manufacture of key carbon neutral or net zero technologies to ensure a sustainable and competitive supply chain. So while this is not directly linked to the Deforestation Regulation, it will also help the EU improve supply chain resilience and have an impact overall on sourcing decisions.
So what can companies do to make sure the systems that they put in place are appropriate for all of these regulations that have similar or cross-cutting requirements?
Yeah, good question. So while the EU has announced several legislations, each with its own focus area, the overlap between regulations provide an opportunity for companies to streamline their compliance initiatives. Data-driven tools, such as our TDi's Integrated Compliance Assurance Tool, can be used as a part of the integrated due diligence system to determine where cross-compatibility occurs between regulations. Companies should be putting in place end-to-end due diligence systems anyway that cover a whole range of environmental, social, and governance issues that enable them to better gain visibility across the length and breadth of their supply chains. And this will help them increase resilience overall and increase their readiness for the suite of upcoming regulations around responsible sourcing.
And so finally then, how can TDi specifically help companies to prepare for the EUDR over this next 1 year extension period?
So we can help you throughout your journey and each stage of the due diligence process. Especially within the information collection stage, TDi can help you and consult with your teams on setting up appropriate management systems and deliver trainings and tools to your teams to collect and analyze your supplier data. We can help you with conducting peer benchmarking and map and assess the environmental and social gaps of your stakeholders. We can also help you make sure that you meet the requirements of the regulation and help you report under it, and advise on the cross-compatibility with other regulations and standards to avoid duplication of effort and ensuring you meet your requirements under all applicable regulations and standards. For the risk assessment step, we can use our in-house tools like our global risk map to identify the environmental and human rights risks within countries and commodities you're sourcing from and assess nature-related risks. We can also support your risk mitigation by conducting audits and the development of questionnaires where you have identified information gaps. We can help you develop internal policies and onboarding requirements to make sure that you're getting the information you need. And we can connect you with our partners to design landscape approaches to address any risks that you uncover. TDi has a strong auditing core, and we can help design audits, surveys, and questionnaires for your suppliers. And we can also help you through your reporting process, all the way to designing the publications you need to put on your website to align with the requirements. And on our website, we have also updated a draft due diligence statement, which is free to access and use.
Thanks, Sunil. That's great. We'll draw this episode to a close there. It's clear that there's a lot that individual companies need to do to make sure that they're ready for the EUDR, even with the year extension that's just been approved. That companies should use this period wisely to make sure that they're fully prepared. Even for companies who were ready for the original date, there's still work that can be done to fine-tune new internal systems and due diligence reporting frameworks that they've put in place. If you're not sure where to start or would like advice on how to make sure that your due diligence systems are cross-compatible with all of the regulations that Sunil has mentioned today, then please get in touch with TDi. Thanks for listening to this episode of Suits and Boots.